A former coup leader sits in a military prison, accused of selling his country's secrets to France. But here's what nobody saw coming. His arrest just triggered the largest military purge in Burkina Faso's history. 203 generals forced out overnight. 3,000 soldiers reshuffled across the capital. And now, the same army that once celebrated him is split down the middle. Senior officers calling it a witch hunt. Frontline troops demanding execution. France is being blamed for everything. Russia just became Burkina Faso's new best friend. And Captain Traoré, the man behind it all, has to make one decision that could either cement his revolution or spark the next coup. What happens to Damaba next will determine who controls West Africa's future. This isn't just about one arrest. This is about whether an entire generation can break free from the powers that shape them, or whether trying to break free will destroy them first. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. A military courtroom in Ouagadougou just became the most dangerous room in West Africa. Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, the former coup leader who once controlled Burkina Faso's armed forces, now sits in detention facing treason and espionage charges that could end with a firing squad. But this isn't just about one man's fate. This is about whether Burkina Faso's current military government can survive the fractures tearing through its own ranks, whether a pro-Russian pivot will hold against French pushback, and whether Captain Ibrahim Traoré can consolidate power before his revolution devours itself from within. The arrest didn't just shock the capital. It detonated a crisis that's been building since Traoré seized power in September 2022, overthrowing the very man now locked in military detention. What's unfolding isn't a simple power struggle between two officers. It's a generational war inside one of the Sahel's most unstable militaries, a proxy battle between declining French influence and rising Russian presence, and a test of how far a revolutionary government will go to eliminate threats real or perceived. The charges against Damaba are severe: treason, espionage, collaboration with foreign powers. His alleged crime? Selling national intelligence to Western governments, primarily France, and undermining Burkina Faso's sovereignty during his brief tenure as head of state. For younger soldiers stationed along the front lines battling jihadist insurgents, these accusations confirm what they've suspected for years: that the old guard, the officers trained in French military academies and promoted under French-backed administrations, were never truly loyal to Burkina Faso, that they served foreign interests, while Burkinabe blood soaked into the Sahel dust. But inside the officer corps, the reaction has been starkly different. Senior generals, many of whom owe their ranks to promotions Damaba approved during his time in power, have openly questioned the charges. They're not defending treason. They're arguing the accusations are politically motivated, excessive, and designed to justify a purge that has nothing to do with national security and everything to do with Traoré consolidating absolute control. This isn't whispered dissent in private mess halls. This is open opposition from high-ranking military figures who still command respect, still hold influence, and still have networks that stretch deep into the armed forces. Traoré heard them loud and clear, and his response was swift, ruthless, and calculated. 203 senior officers were forced into early retirement. Not gradual attrition, not voluntary exits. A purge. Officers who had spent decades in the military, who had risen through the ranks under successive governments, were suddenly pushed out in a single sweeping move. The official framing was administrative reorganization, a necessary refreshment of leadership to align the military with the revolution's goals. But no one inside Burkina Faso's defense establishment believes that. This was about eliminating potential coup threats, removing officers whose loyalty to Traoré was questionable, and sending an unmistakable message: dissent will not be tolerated. The purge didn't stop at retirements. Over 3,000 troops were reshuffled in and around Ouagadougou, the capital where coups are planned and executed. Units were broken up, reassigned, scattered across different commands. The goal was clear: dismantle any networks that could coordinate against Traoré, fragment potential conspiracies before they coalesce, and ensure that no single officer or faction could mobilize enough force to challenge the current government. This is textbook counterinsurgency tactics turned inward. The same methods used to prevent jihadist cells from organizing are now being applied to the military itself. Traore isn't just fighting external enemies. He's fighting the possibility of betrayal from within, and he's doing it with a kind of paranoia that either saves revolutionary governments or destroys them. What makes this internal war so volatile is that it's not just about personalities or power. It's about two fundamentally different visions of what Burkina Faso should be and who it should align with. The older officer class, many trained at French military schools like Saint-Cyr or in joint operations with French forces, grew up in a system where France was the security guarantor, where Paris provided training, intelligence, equipment, and diplomatic cover, where being pro-French wasn't seen as treasonous but pragmatic. These officers don't necessarily love France, but they see the relationship as strategically necessary, especially in a region where jihadist groups are expanding and no single African nation has the capacity to fight them alone. Younger soldiers see it differently. They've watched French troops operate on Burkinabe soil for years without defeating the insurgency. They've seen French intelligence agencies maintain deep ties with political elites, while ordinary Burkinabe suffered. They've witnessed France's reluctance to fully commit resources even as violence escalated. And they've come to a conclusion that's now driving policy in Ouagadougou. France isn't here to help Burkina Faso win. France is here to manage instability in ways that protect French interests. That belief, whether entirely accurate or not, is now the ideological foundation of Traoré's government. And it's why Damiba's arrest resonates so powerfully with the rank and file. For them, this isn't a show trial. It's accountability. It's a reckoning with a generation of officers who prioritized foreign relationships over national survival. But here's the complication. Damaba wasn't always seen as a French puppet. When he launched his coup in January 2022, overthrowing President Marc Christian Cabaret, he did so with popular support. The public was exhausted by rising violence, military casualties, and government incompetence. Damaba promised to restore security, mobilize the army, and take the fight to jihadist groups with renewed aggression. For months, he was the hero, the soldier who stepped in when civilian leadership failed. But his tenure unraveled quickly. Security didn't improve. Attacks continued. Soldiers grew frustrated. And rumors began circulating that Damaba was too close to French advisors, that he was consulting Paris before making critical military decisions, that he was hesitating to break from the old security architecture because it would anger Western partners. Whether those rumors were true or exaggerated, they became the narrative. And in September 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young officer commanding forces in the eastern combat zones, led a counter-coup that toppled Damaba and seized power with a platform explicitly framed around sovereignty and anti-imperialism. Traoré didn't just remove Damaba. He built an entire political identity around rejecting what Damaba represented. French military cooperation was scaled back. French intelligence presence was questioned. Diplomatic language shifted from partnership to suspicion. And crucially, Traoré opened the door to Russia. Not quietly, not tentatively, publicly and aggressively. Russian military instructors arrived. Security agreements were signed. Propaganda praising Russian support flooded state media and social platforms. The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso was pivoting away from France and toward Moscow, and anyone opposing that pivot was opposing the revolution itself. This is where Damiba's arrest becomes more than a domestic legal matter. It's a signal to France, to regional powers, to Western governments watching the Sahel slip further from their influence. Traoré is saying that the old guard is finished, that collaboration with France is no longer tolerable, and that officers who maintain those ties will face consequences. Russia has capitalized on this opening with precision. Moscow understands that it doesn't need to replace France entirely in Burkina Faso. It just needs to be seen as the alternative, the partner willing to provide support without the lecturing, the conditionality, the historical baggage of colonialism. Russian involvement isn't massive in scale, but it's symbolically powerful. It reinforces the narrative that Burkina Faso is breaking free, that sovereignty is achievable, and that the West's monopoly on security partnerships in Africa is over. For Traore, Russian support isn't just military. It's legitimacy. It's proof that his revolution has international backing, that he's not isolated, and that rejecting France doesn't mean abandoning all external partnerships. But it also locks him into a geopolitical corner. The more he relies on Russian backing, the more he alienates Western governments and regional actors still aligned with France. The more he purges French-linked officers, the more he narrows his base of support within the military itself. And that's the trap he's navigating now. The purge of 203 officers removed immediate threats, but it also created a class of disgruntled veterans with nothing to lose. Early retirement doesn't erase networks. It doesn't eliminate influence. It just pushes dissent underground where it's harder to monitor and easier to weaponize. These officers still have contacts, still have loyalists serving in active units, and still have reasons to want Traore gone. If they coordinate with external actors, if they find support from governments threatened by Burkina Faso's Russian pivot, if they exploit future military failures or public discontent, they could become the nucleus of a counter-revolution. Traore knows this, which is why the reshuffling of 3,000 troops in the capital wasn't an afterthought. It was insurance. By fragmenting units, rotating commanders, and breaking up cohesive groups, he's trying to make coordination impossible. But there's a cost. Military effectiveness suffers when units lose cohesion. Trust erodes when soldiers are constantly moved and reassigned. And in a country fighting an active jihadist insurgency, any decline in military performance has immediate, deadly consequences. Frontline troops are already stretched thin. Jihadist groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State continue launching attacks across northern and eastern regions. Civilians are caught between insurgents, military forces, and self-defense militias. Humanitarian conditions are deteriorating. And while Traore's government talks about sovereignty and revolution, the violence hasn't stopped. If the reshuffling weakens military operations, if purges remove experienced officers who actually know how to fight insurgencies, if internal paranoia distracts from external threats, then the security situation could collapse further. And that collapse would undermine the entire justification for military rule in the first place. Traore came to power promising to do what Damaba couldn't: win the war. If he fails, if violence escalates under his watch, then his revolutionary rhetoric won't protect him. The same soldiers who backed him against Damaba could turn against him if they believe he's leading the country into deeper chaos. This is where Damaba's fate becomes critical. He's in detention, facing charges that could result in execution. But he hasn't been tried yet. He hasn't been sentenced. And that delay is deliberate. Traore is weighing options, calculating risks, trying to determine what outcome serves his interests best. Executing Damaba would send the strongest possible message. That treason will not be tolerated. That collaboration with France is a capital offense. That the revolution is irreversible. It would satisfy the younger soldiers demanding blood, the hardliners who see leniency as weakness, and the factions pushing for a complete break with the past. But it would also radicalize opposition. Senior officers already uneasy about the purge would see execution as confirmation that Traore is a tyrant, not a reformer. Regional governments would condemn it. International pressure would intensify. And France, which still has significant leverage in West Africa through economic ties, diplomatic networks, and security relationships with neighboring countries, could retaliate in ways that destabilize Burkina Faso further. Alternatively, Traore could spare Damaba, sentence him to prison, exile him quietly, or engineer a political compromise that neutralizes him without martyrdom. This would be the pragmatic choice. It would reduce internal tensions, signal that Traore isn't bloodthirsty, and create space for reconciliation with moderate factions in the military. But it would enrage the base. The soldiers who see Damaba as a traitor would view leniency as betrayal. It would weaken Traore's revolutionary credibility embolden his critics, and suggest that he's willing to compromise on core principles when pressured. In revolutionary politics, that kind of perceived weakness can be fatal. So Traore is caught. Either decision carries risks. Either path could trigger backlash. And while he delays, anger builds on both sides. Hardliners grow impatient. Moderates grow anxious. And Damaba sits in detention, a living symbol of everything this crisis represents. France is watching all of this with increasing alarm. Paris has lost military bases in Mali, been expelled from Burkina Faso's security architecture, and watched Russian influence expand across the Sahel. Damaba represented the last generation of Francophone African officers who maintained genuine ties to France, who believed in the partnership model, and who could be relied upon to align with French strategic interests when it mattered. His arrest and potential execution would close that chapter definitively. It would signal to every other French-trained officer in the region that loyalty to Paris is now a liability, not an asset. That the old system is finished. That a new generation is taking over with no interest in preserving relationships built over decades. France doesn't have many options to respond. Direct intervention is politically impossible. The backlash would be catastrophic, both in Burkina Faso and across Africa, where anti-French sentiment is already surging. Economic pressure could backfire, pushing Burkina Faso even closer to Russia and China. Diplomatic isolation would only reinforce Traoré's narrative that the West is hostile to African sovereignty. So Paris is left with indirect strategies: supporting regional mediation efforts, maintaining pressure through international institutions, quietly backing opposition figures or exile groups, hoping that internal contradictions within Traoré's government create opportunities for alternative leadership to emerge. But none of these are quick fixes. None guarantee success. And all require patience that France may not have as its influence in the Sahel continues eroding. Russia, meanwhile, is doubling down. Moscow sees Burkina Faso as part of a larger strategy to displace Western influence across Africa. It's not just about Ouagadougou. It's about creating a network of governments aligned against France, dependent on Russian security support, and willing to provide diplomatic backing for Moscow's global positions. Burkina Faso joining Mali, Niger, and potentially other Sahel nations in a Russian-aligned bloc would fundamentally reshape West African geopolitics. It would create a zone where Western governments have limited access, where French economic interests are vulnerable, and where alternative models of governance and security partnership can be tested. For Russia, the investment is relatively small. A few hundred military instructors, some equipment transfers, diplomatic cover at the United Nations, propaganda support through state media and social platforms. The returns, however, are significant. Geopolitical influence, access to natural resources, a foothold in a strategically important region, and the satisfaction of undermining Western dominance in a part of the world where France once operated unchallenged. But Russia's model has limitations. It doesn't come with the economic development packages that China offers. It doesn't provide the institutional capacity building that Western partners claim to deliver. And it doesn't address the underlying drivers of instability: poverty, governance failures, ethnic tensions, and jihadist ideology. Russian support can help Traoré survive internal threats. It can provide enough military capability to contain insurgencies temporarily. But it can't solve Burkina Faso's structural problems. And if violence continues escalating despite Russian backing, if economic conditions worsen, if public frustration grows, then the honeymoon with Moscow will end just as it did with Paris. This is the unresolved tension at the heart of Burkina Faso's current crisis. Traoré has successfully framed his government as anti-imperialist, pro-sovereignty, and revolutionary. He's purged threats, reshuffled the military, and aligned with Russia as a counterweight to France. But he hasn't delivered security. He hasn't stabilized the country. And he hasn't proven that his model of governance can succeed where previous governments failed. The soldiers backing him now could turn against him tomorrow if results don't materialize. The public support he enjoys could evaporate if violence continues and living conditions deteriorate. And the external partners he's courting could abandon him if he becomes a liability rather than an asset. Damiba's trial will be the first major test of how far Traore is willing to go, and whether he can manage the contradictions within his own coalition. If he executes Damaba, he'll radicalize opposition but solidify his revolutionary credentials. If he spares him, he'll ease tensions but risk appearing weak. If he delays indefinitely, he'll keep both sides on edge without resolving the fundamental question of what this government stands for. What happens next will determine not just Traore's fate, but the trajectory of the entire Sahel region. Will French influence continue collapsing, or will Paris find ways to reassert itself through proxies and partnerships? Will Russian backing prove sustainable, or will Moscow's limitations become apparent as instability persists? Will younger African officers inspired by Traore's example launch similar movements in other countries, or will his government collapse as a cautionary tale about revolutionary overreach? The answers aren't clear yet. What is clear is that Burkina Faso has become a laboratory for testing new models of power, new forms of alliance, and new strategies for navigating a multipolar world where old certainties no longer apply. The arrest of Paul-Henri Damiba isn't just about one man's alleged crimes. It's about whether a generation of soldiers can break free from the structures that shape them, whether sovereignty can be won through purges and realignments, and whether revolution can survive the chaos it creates. Traore's next decision on Damiba's fate will answer some of those questions, but it will also raise new ones. Because in the Sahel, every solution creates new problems, every purge generates new enemies, and every revolution risks devouring its own children before it can deliver on its promises.